introductory slides out of the way while people still join us after work. So welcome, my name is Eric Mary Bojek. I'm the director for the Center for Real Estate Entrepreneurship at the George Mason University School of Business. For those of you that don't know us, the center is the school's platform for real estate education. We have academic real estate programs, both graduate and undergraduate level. And we also put on educational programming like the webinar that we're having this evening. Before we go forward, I'd like to thank the corporate members of our board of advisors for the center. These are the leading real estate companies in the Washington Metro DC area that provide the financial support and guidance for us to be able to put on programming like the one tonight. So if you'd like to join us and are interested in supporting real estate education at George Mason University, please drop me an email at my email address at the bottom of the screen. So just a couple of announcements as well. For those of you that are joining us that are architects and are taking this as part of your continuing education, at the end of tonight's event, please feel free to drop me an email at my email address there at the bottom as proof that you've attended the webinar, and we will forward your name to AIA Virginia, who is providing 1.5 continuing credits if you watch tonight's program. This webinar is being recorded and a link will be sent to the people registered. And also, please use the Q&A buttons on your Zoom screen to ask questions throughout the presentation. We will have a moderated Q&A after the presentation. But feel free to put in your questions throughout the program so we can get to them after. So cul-de-sac is a case study of a car-free neighborhood development. It is one of the first in the country designed to be residential car-free and parking-free. It'll be served by alternative transportation and mobility options for its residents. Located 2.5 miles from downtown Tempe, Arizona on 16 acres, this mixed-use residential community incorporates missing middle housing density and walkable community design. Cul-de-sac is currently under construction and expected to deliver some of its first phases in 2022. Thank you for joining us tonight to hear about this innovative development from Dan Perolik, the founding principal of Opticos Design. Dan is an architect, urban designer, and the founding principal of Opticos, which has grown to be a nationally sought-after company of thought leaders in urban placemaking, innovative housing design, and policy and zoning reform. Dan coined the term missing middle housing and is a champion of the now international missing middle housing movement. Dan also co-authored the book Form-Based Codes and co-founded the nonprofit think tank, the Form-Based Code Institute. He is a valuable partner and advisor for cities and developers across the country who are striving to respond to the demand for vibrant urban and urban-like living. He holds a Bachelor of Architecture from the University of Notre Dame and a Master of Urban Design from the University of California at Berkeley. So without further ado, I'll turn over the share screen to Dan, and we'll hear all about this fascinating development called cul-de-sac.
Well, thank you, Eric, and good evening to everybody. This is a topic that I'm always excited to present and discuss with a diverse audience, different people with different backgrounds. And so just a couple of things is, so cul-de-sac Tempe will be the largest car-free community built from scratch in the United States when it's completed. So super excited about that. If you are into social media and you're doing any tweeting, feel free to either use, call me out at Daniel Perolik or my company's Twitter account at Opticos Design while I'm going through the presentation today. This cul-de-sac Tempe project has gotten a tremendous amount of press and interest, which I'm always excited to see, including some of the big name publications you see along the bottom here. And I'm just always happy to sort of dive into to discussing kind of a little bit of the history and the design approach and the program to this particular project. As Eric mentioned, I just want to say one thing. I'm the founding principal of Opticos Design. We just celebrated our 20th anniversary. And I started Opticos because I wanted to work at both the architecture and the urban design and planning scale. I have been able to do that for the past 20 years with my company Opticos as we've grown. And we work with both public sector clients and private sector clients across the country at a variety of scales, ranging from 1 acre cottage court infill with a developer like our River House project here in Healdsburg, California, to a citywide comprehensive plan update with the city of Memphis. And so the work ranges in a pretty broad range of scales. And I have a very talented team that work with me on all these projects that I just like to give a shout out. We're also a founding B Corporation, which means we are committed to a triple bottom line of social, fiscal, and environmental responsibility, and not only in our projects, but all of our decision making. That's a really important foundation for us at Opticos. It has been for the past 15 years, and it informs our business strategy as well as project selection. I wanted to start off with this little video that was created to give a quick summary of the approach and the intent of cul-de-sac. Let me just get this started here. So I think that was a really great overview. Cul-de-sac has been a tremendous client to us and for this great leaders with this project. And I feel like this is the type of visionary thinking that is really necessary to deliver 21st century housing choices. And it's been a great opportunity to work with the cul-de-sac team. As a start, I want to just talk a little bit about the program and the general overview of the project. As Eric mentioned, the site is about 16 acres. It's located along Apache Boulevard, which is one of the major east-west corridors cutting through Tempe. It's also the light rail corridor. And it's approximately 2 miles from both downtown Tempe and the ASU campus. And so fairly close to those amenities, but in a fairly somewhat undeveloped and underutilized context. And what I really like about the approach that cul-de-sac tasked us with was that, you could very easily attempt to do a car-free project by simply taking the cars out of the equation of an otherwise fairly conventional project in terms of the product type, as well as the master planning process. But cul-de-sac really challenged us to really think outside the box, not only just in terms of a type of place we could create without a car, but also thinking really creatively about the housing types that we would create in this project, as well as the type of place that we would be creating, so that it would be something that was different than anything that has been designed and built in the United States in recent history, and maybe even sort of ever. So it was great to get that task of just really thinking outside the box on all fronts. So this is an overview of the master plan. It's going to be approximately just a little under 640 units. The units range in size from 680 to a little over 1,100 square feet. Generates a density of about 40 units per acre. I'll do a really interesting comparison later to a a previous scheme with 7-story buildings on the site and thousands of parking spaces. There's about a 30,000 square foot non-residential program, and this was really critical to sort of creating a community that had walkability internally so that day-to-day services and amenities, a certain number of them could be delivered within the mixed use component in the center of this community. There are 0 parking spaces provided for the residential units, but there are about 150 parking spaces provided for the commercial uses to make sure that the commercial uses are viable and are accessible by the broader community. And there are 49 delivery and car share spaces programmed very thoughtfully throughout the project. I'll talk a little bit more about the construction, but the groundbreaking actually took place late last year. And you'll see some really great slides of the progress that's being made. It's really exciting to see the project go vertical as the construction begins. But you noticed in that little video that I showed that gave a great overview of the intent that cul-de-sac had for this community, is that one of the primary issues was thinking about the environmental impact of our transportation choices and the fact that the main source of our greenhouse emissions is transportation, and secondarily buildings. And so a really thoughtful approach to removing the automobile from the equation can go a long way in reducing our carbon footprint and our greenhouse gas emissions, which is a really fantastic way to look at sort of the sustainability component of this particular project. Just diving down to a street level view, the site is right across the street from the light rail station, the Smith Martin light rail station. So it was very important to think about that transition from the light rail platform and across the Apache Boulevard into the project and into the community, and thinking about an appropriate gateway that welcomes both residents and visitors into the community. And so really important thought process. And so also just this idea of the project is car free, but I think more importantly, the thinking was the project would ultimately be mobility rich. And they had this concept from the very beginning to create partnerships with different mobility companies to deliver a palette of mobility choices to their residents. And I'll give you an update later on the successes they've had in delivering those choices. In terms of the design inspiration, what we always like to do in our projects is step back and think about the types of places that inspire us, I guess, aesthetically, experientially. But in the case of cul-de-sac Tempe, we also needed a series of case studies, both in terms of the placemaking and urbanism and the different elements of architecture and other sort of public spaces that would effectively address and mitigate the extreme desert climate that is inherent in this site and its context, and make sure that someone on foot, someone on a bike, someone on an electric scooter could comfortably navigate the community from one end to the other with a primarily shaded experience. And so, you know, as I was thinking about the types of places I've visited or traveled to recently, a lot of places came to mind of historic centers, whether it be in Spain or Italy or Egypt or somewhere in South America where it might have been 100 degrees outside in the middle of summer, but it was quite comfortable still walking down the streets because the buildings, number one, the buildings provided a fairly continuous shaded experience. And then there was also some slight breezes and other elements that made the experience comfortable from a pedestrian experience. So we looked at a broad range of different places, different types of architecture, different elements to deliver that. And of course, right, shade was a number one priority. And what we explored very carefully, what are the different ways, both formally and informally, that we can provide shade, whether you're sort of navigating the site sitting and entertaining within one of the courtyard spaces or the small plaza spaces. It became a really important aspect. And what you'll see as I show you more of the actual design is this idea of the really narrow paseo, small as like this image on the right with, 8 or 10 feet building face to building face, became a really interesting prototype for us to learn from and integrate into the project as a way to provide a shaded experience as you work your way through the project. And these are just some of the, what we call the precedent images or the inspiration, and just everything down to the types of signage and the art that's integrated into the project became really important for the cul-de-sac team and for our team as well, as we thought about how you would experience in this place, how it would really encourage a strong sense and foster a strong sense of community. And, one really interesting architect for the architects online here, we studied the Egyptian architect Hassan Fathi, who's done some really beautiful work in Egypt that responds very specifically to that desert climate. And there was just something really evocative about his work that we really liked and wanted to implement into the project from a functionality standpoint in this desert context, as well as aesthetically. So in terms of the next step I wanted to talk about is just a brief design overview, some of the big picture elements of the project. But this is going up several thousand feet to take a look at the project. The light rail stations in the lower right-hand corner. You can see that it's a very organic pattern that we've created here, very similar to some of those precedents we studied. It's a series. There's one primary larger paseo that works its way from the left to the right through the project that functioned as a real organizer for the layout of the project, but also functioned as a means of fire and emergency access through the site, which is one of the big challenges that I'll talk a little bit about. But you can see that there's a series of really fine-grained paseos that go both east, west, and north-south that provide a number of different routes and experiences as you navigate through the project. And the small blocks are composed of small L-shaped and sort of bar-shaped 2- and 3-story buildings that are oriented around a series of courtyards, and talk about those in a little bit. But this is the more formal sort of slight aerial view of that gateway plaza. And basically this is just reinforcing the fact that every resident within the community should be within a 4-minute walk from light rail, a 1-minute walk or bike from a rideshare pickup, and a 1-minute walk from a bike or scooter parking station. So those mobility choices are really important and embedded and thoughtfully placed throughout the community as we were planning it. This is just a low aerial view showing the main plaza space along that primary east-west paseo. This is where the non-commercial or the mixed-use component is focused around, starting at that gateway plaza and then working its way into this main plaza space. And you can see here that we wanted to keep the plaza space really small because of the issue with the heat. And we wanted to provide a lot of shaded areas and sub areas within the main plaza to provide a comfortable experience even in the hottest of the weather. And as this is the image that you've been seeing behind me, but this is one of the images that seems to resonate most with a lot of people. This is an image within one of the interior block courtyard spaces. Every single unit has direct access onto one of these courtyard spaces. And you can see that the massing is nicely articulated and sort of broken down as it engages to allow the residents and the units to engage and activate these courtyard spaces. So a lot of thought went into the shape, the sizes, the orientation, and the shading that happens in all of these internal block courtyard spaces. We did a lot of shade and shadow studies in SketchUp and integrated those into our thought process. And so here's a This video is a bit crude, I apologize, but it just gives a really good overview of what it would be like to walk from the light rail station down the major Paseo into the main plaza space and then into one of the inner block network of courtyard spaces. So let me play this for you. So I'm going to just narrate this a little bit. So on the right, you see a restaurant, which already has a tenant. On the left, you see the coffee shop and co-working space in the coffee shop. They have a tenant for the coffee shop already that I'll talk about in a little bit. A small market right in front of you there in that 3-story mixed-use building, which there's a tenant for already. So you're working your way down this main Paseo with a shaded arcade on the left. And working your way into the main plaza space, there's a small, a bit iconic hosting building in front of you here that can host small events, yoga sessions, other exercise or small parties. You can see these uses are very much activating this main space, lots of places to sit. These are live work spaces on this particular edge as we make our way into one of the small passages that goes into this series of courtyard spaces within the block. And we're basically working our way through to the primary. Every block has one designated primary courtyard space that's a bit larger, that's a little bit more programmed than the other spaces, similar to what you saw in the rendering behind me. But you can see a little bit more program in this and get a better sense of the scale and really the porosity of the number of different ways to get into and out of these sites and the way that the units activate the spaces. So that's just a really neat overview. So architecturally, I put these in here because I knew there'd be some architects. There's basically, we created a unique system of repeatable building types with these primary 4 types. There's a little bit more than this, but these are the core types of just a simple combination of 2- and 3-story bar buildings with a range of different unit types and sizes that are put together in different ways to create those series of courtyards and to also engage and activate the Paseo spaces. And you can see here, this is just one example of a block, and each color represents a different one of those building types. And you can see here, this is actually the block that we walked into in that video, and we walked into this entry at the upper center part and then in through the project into the main courtyard space. And you can see just a really series of intimate, thoughtful spaces activated by the units and that provide a variety of scale and texture as you experience the project. Now, what I'd like to say about the architecture is we wanted to be really thoughtful and really restrained on the architecture itself, because we felt we wanted to let the buildings play their role as fabric buildings, really just background buildings, and define and activate the spaces, because you'll never actually see these buildings in elevation like this. You're usually seeing them at the really tight oblique angle. So they're really about defining and activating those paseos and those courtyard spaces. And everything on the right-hand side, you see a number of a palette of shading elements that we created to put on the west-facing and the southern-facing elevations, primarily to shade and passively cool the buildings. They're also, all of these units are only 1 room deep. So we felt that this was a really great idea to maximize natural light, but also to provide cross ventilation into the units to make it more comfortable and to live without, having the air conditioner on full capacity all hours of the day. So I want to mention the process was really fun. We actually scheduled a series of multi-day internal design charrettes in our offices, and that included the cul-de-sac team, but it also included a range of multidisciplinary consultants, including a landscape architect, Floor and Associates. Chris Floor's company out of Phoenix was an integral part of the team, a great collaborator. We also worked with a retail consultant, Lorenzo Perez, who helped define the types and sizes of spaces that would be viable in this type of project in this market. And a series of other consultants or construction consultants, development consultant to help us refine our designs, and as they crunched numbers, making sure the project would ultimately be feasible to construct. And this is just a really nice view looking down that main paseo with the hosting building on the left, the main plaza just beyond it, and looking toward the that light rail station and the restaurant building that's now mostly completed construction-wise, that takes you to the light rail station. So just a really interesting project. So a little bit of a focus on the site plan and the public spaces, because the public spaces in particular, because we were able to remove cars from this equation, over 60% of the site area is allocated to public space, whether it be a small plaza, a larger plaza, small paseos, a series of different courtyard sizes, a small park, dog park, pool area, right? It's really nice to be able to sort of open up the opportunities for those high quality and large number of public spaces by removing the cars. And just some process images of some early sketches of the potential arrangements of the blocks and the paseos and the public spaces, some initial sort of concept sketches beginning to demonstrate the character and quality of the large and small paseos, the articulation and simplicity of the buildings, as well as just like the circulation of the project. And I've mentioned this a number of times, but this is a great image that illustrates this idea of a network of pedestrian-only paseos. They'll be decomposed granite primarily. The units at the ground level enter off of the paseo, but also have that access into the courtyard space as well. There'll be landscaping sort of along a number of the edges along those paseos, but also the landscaping from within the courtyards creeping over the walls, like you see in a lot of the examples that we had shown, and just in really interesting vistas that draw you through the project. You can see just that little chimney element on that building at the far end. People out on their balconies will sort of also help activate the space. And as I mentioned, the paseos are as narrow as 8 feet, and we felt that that was enough to provide a comfortable proportion space, but also small enough to provide shading for large portions of the days, even in the summer. So you can see this is just a different iteration of the project. You can see in that upper left-hand corner in that darker red where the light rail station is, that the dark red represents ground floor, commercial, retail, food and beverage uses, and about 30,000 square feet. You can begin to see here the different block structures and the paseo structures that there are as you work your way across the main. Let me just do a little annotation here for you. As you work your way through this main east-west paseo, that's that organizer that I talked about, you can see that there's a series of a little bit wider secondary paseos that work their way into the site, either from the edge or from that were integrated for emergency access. You can imagine the puzzle that we went through, but there's also this secondary, let me do a different color here. There's this secondary hierarchy of paseos that are really, those are the 8-foot ones that give you these really interesting experiences as you walk or make your way through this project. And so it's a really fine-grained network of opportunities to navigate the site. I thought I would share this diagram. It's a little bit technical, but this just simply illustrates, whoops, the fire access approach. Sorry, let me erase my other lines. So you can see on this what I had mentioned earlier, but we had to be really thoughtful about, fire hoses reaching every element of this project, but we wanted to make sure that the widths that we were required to provide for that emergency access we're not compromising this pedestrian only experience. And we're really spent a lot of time and energy working with this and working with the fire department as well as the other emergency access folks in the city of Tempe to make sure we came up with a solution that worked for them, but that didn't ultimately compromise the vision that we had in mind for the project. Sorry, I seem to be locked up here a little bit. Give me just 1 second as I try to get my pointer. Here we go. Sorry, my cursor. Give me just 1 second. I'm going to pop out of this and pop right back in. My cursor seems to have disappeared. Sorry about this. This is the first time this has happened, but so I'll do this on the fly, but give me just a second here. I mean, you can see that, right, there's the design vision and the design intent, but there's all the technical aspects, whether it be emergency access or even just the integration of infrastructure into underground infrastructure that became a real technical and a design challenge that kind of it was actually really fun to work our way through during the process. But just another view of a Paseo, a view from the entry plaza to the light rail station. And then just a quick thought about entitlement. The project was actually part of a pre-approved planned area development plan, which you can see that phase 1 area in orange and the phase 4 and the phase 2 is where the cul-de-sac site is. And so the process was going through and amending this pre-entitled pad. And we basically had to write our own development standards due to the unique design approach and nature of this particular project. I can answer questions about that. In terms of progress, this area in red designates the phase 1. And in particular, that phase 1 commercial piece is actually what cul-de-sac decided to build first. And we can discuss that as well. This is just an aerial image of that Gateway Plaza with the restaurant under construction and the market building under construction. And, you know, what's really interesting about this is this project got a tremendous amount of interest. It had 335 million press impressions when it went public in November of 2019. And a great progress is that cul-de-sac was actually able to negotiate partnerships with these organizations, with rideshare, with the Valley Metro, Envoy Car Share, and Micromobility with Freebird. And they're going to be delivering a mobility suite that's worth about $3,000 a year to their residents. So once again, it's car free, but the reality is a better term is mobility rich. And I really like this aspect. And it's really pretty interesting that there's 151 residents who've put their names on a wait list with a $100 refundable deposit, but there's 3,300 people on an interested list. And I know that cul-de-sac actually started renting fairly recently and within just the past several weeks, and I wasn't able to get that updated information, but the first sort of group of units leased in a matter of hours. And so it's looking like there's a strong interest. A large majority of the phase 1 community members are moving from out of state to live in this project to kind of show the real demand and desire for people to live car-free, but to live car-free in an environment that's this neighborhood or missing middle scale. And a pretty broad range of types of residents who are interested, ranging from young professionals, even to empty nesters, and some young families as well. So the other great progress is that it's always hard to sign the first round of leases to activate and provide the amenities in the early phases of these projects, but they have these 3 companies and business owners lined up and leases signed that will provide Vikram's street corner urban market in that space that I showed in that fly through, Tacos Chihuas, Armando and Nadia sort of have a local cult following, and this is their first bricks and mortar location. And then Mike Funk's Fire Creek Coffee, which is based out of Flagstaff, and is a really great sort of tenant to have in that coffee shop space that we had envisioned early on in the project. But the other interesting thing that Cul-de-sac is doing is they're actually planting the seeds of community with a lot of pop-up events. And this is just an in-progress pop-up event that's a holiday market to get people excited about the project and start to foster a sense of community with the neighborhood. And they've developed a following of over 45,000 followers on their various social media platforms. So there's been a ton of interest in this. And I was really excited that NAHB awarded Cul-de-sac a Game Changer Award earlier this year. I was really excited that such an institutional organization sort of acknowledged the sort of groundbreaking concept and idea behind Cul-de-sac, and just was really excited to get that sort of recognition. So let me show you this slide. That's the latest from November of progress of the site. This is the mixed use component that's actually quite a bit further underway now, with the second and third mixed use building having its the concrete podiums poured, but you can begin to see the shapes begin, the public spaces begin to take shape. And then this is actually the first of the pedestrian or the courtyard housing blocks. So they're doing the underground infrastructure. So that's just a really nice glimpse. It's super exciting to see the project under construction, and you know, also see the really strong interest and response from renters. I'm going to close up with just a few concluding thoughts here. This is the project on the left is the project that was already approved on this same site, and the elevations of at the exact same scale of the cul-de-sac buildings on the same site. You can see that there's a dramatic difference in the scale of the buildings, and the project on the left generated about 696 dwelling units and 1,400 parking spaces in 7 stories, versus the 640 units and 201 parking spaces being delivered in 3 stories. And the project on the left did not move forward because it was not feasible. It didn't, the pro forma didn't work out, and a part of it was, if you just simply do the quick math of $20,000 a space, that's a $30 million cost just for the parking structures. And so it made the project infeasible. And so this is another really interesting way to achieve medium densities and deliver a really high quality of life, but do it at a smaller, more intimate neighborhood scale, and deliver that high quality car-free living. So the other thing I want to mention is we're innovating with other projects in the country. This is a missing middle neighborhood that we master planned and developed the architecture for in the Omaha, Nebraska metro. And it's triplexes up to 8plexes, and it's all for rent. And it has redefined the top end of the rental price points in the Omaha metro, has been extremely successful for our client. It has proven that there is viability in Class A multifamily to be thinking about smaller house scale missing middle buildings laid out in a neighborhood format, as opposed to larger scale garden apartments just oriented around parking lots. So Eric mentioned this earlier. I just want to mention that we've been doing a lot of innovative work across the country with both cities, counties, and developers for the past 10 years. I created the concept of missing middle housing in this diagram almost 10 years ago now. We launched missingmiddlehousing.com in 2016 as a free online resource. In middle of last year, my book, Missing Middle Housing, thinking big and building small to respond to today's housing crisis was released by Island Press. So I just encourage you to take a look at that. Feel free to reach out to me on social media at any of these accounts, or to even drop me an email with thoughts and questions. And just one last shout out to my team at Opticos. I have a really talented group of architects, urban designers, and just other talented designers that we're working with. And we're excited to be a B Corporation. Feel free to ask questions about that as well. And with that, I will open it up to Q&A.
Thank you, Dan. Really interesting project. There's a couple of questions already. So for those of you that have questions with anything in the presentation or anything that Dan has said, please free to pop it into the Q&A button on your Zoom share. First question from the chat. Somebody was curious about the masonry screen details. Seemed to be every other opening on the arcade had a masonry screen detail. Was that was there something behind that, or was this just an architectural detail for the property?
That's a super interesting question. I've never had anybody notice that, but we did design that building, so I'm super aware of. So the arcade, we were limited on the depth of the arcade just due to the compact nature of the site plan. And so we felt we wanted to maximize the shading for the pedestrian as they work their way through the arcade. And so that's why we put the masonry screens on every other one of the arcade elements. And we saw some really great precedents in these desert cities that did that. So we just wanted to integrate it mostly for pedestrian comfort and functionality of that arcade space.
Okay. Was there a required affordability program for this project? If so, what is the mix of market rate versus affordable rate units?
There is not a required affordability. The city doesn't have a required affordability component, and so the units will be rented at market rate. I feel like we had discussions with cul-de-sac early on about sort of ensuring long-term affordability, at least to a certain percentage of the units, because they were innovating on so many other aspects of this project. They wanted proof of concept first before they sort of really started formalizing that affordability component. But I'm looking forward to that. The units are a bit smaller than the sort of what's typical in this market, and what we found in our projects is even just being 15 to 20% smaller can make the projects just that much more attainable from a price standpoint. And so that's just one way we often achieve that. But the short answer is there's no formal required affordability in the project.
Next issue has to do with spillover parking. Were there issues with adjacent communities pushing back, particularly the concern about spillover parking? How did you address that? And this actually was a concern with a cottage community that was built here in Northern Virginia a couple of years ago.
Yeah, I mean, we were ready to, have some tough conversations about potential spillover parking, but the site is a little bit unusual, and so I think because there's to the south side of the site, there's actually light industrial uses, and so those neighbors are not going to be as worried about spillover because everything happens internally to their sites. And then because Apache Boulevard is such a kind of a large, heavily trafficked corridor, it created a bit of a nice transition from the site into the neighborhoods, to the point where the residents really weren't super concerned about the spillover parking. And the residents that move into cul-de-sac are committing to live car-free. So that's another thing to think about. And there's, even just on the perimeter of the site, there are, if I'm remembering correctly, hundreds of parking spaces just on the perimeter, because it's such a large site. And some of those are being used for car share. Some are being used for Uber and Lyft pickup. Some of them are being used for deliveries, but others it's parking for guests and people that are visiting and supporting the local businesses that are in the mixed use center.
The next question is about accessibility. I guess it's handicap accessibility. How was that handled, particularly with the buildings that are located more in the middle of the site?
Yeah, so we had to think about, and it was one of those other really important but challenging sort of puzzles, but making sure that, even the units at the core of the blocks were accessible, and that the routes were accessible, and that the units were accessible. So we definitely thought about that, and it was one of those efforts and sort of details that took quite a bit of time and energy and back and forth to make sure it resolved. But it was an important one and a challenging one. But we felt that we were definitely able to achieve all of that.
Next one is an expansion of the inspiration for the design. Does Philadelphia small streets, or I guess a lot of small streets in older colonial type neighborhoods, did they provide any inspiration or guidance for how people lived in such spaces, I guess, in the United States in the past?
Yeah, I'm pretty familiar with those small historic streets in Philadelphia. I'd say the only reason we shied away from looking at Philadelphia is just because the weather is so much different than the weather of Tempe. I think spatially, those are really fantastic spaces for sure. And proportions are really nice. The way the buildings engage the spaces are super effective. But we were trying to look for more precedents that had hotter climates as the more applicable examples. But yeah, we're aware of them, and those are great examples, especially in cooler climates. And I just see a question here on, is the idea expandable to nearby sites, or I would say to other cities? And I know that I can say that Cul-de-sac is exploring opportunities in other markets and other cities for sure. And their ultimate goal is to build a car-free city. So they're just seeing this as a pilot project, and they want to go up, to that next bigger scale. They're thinking probably, between 50 and 100 acres for a next one, and then continue to get bigger. So they have big vision, which is super exciting to think about and to support them in that drive.
The next question, I guess, is related around the mobility options. So somebody here is asking about air mobility. So with the rapid change of the technology in that space, I guess either for package air delivery, which has been touted, or even for people, has the project been designed to take that into consideration about the changing nature of that technology?
Absolutely. So I didn't mention this, that Brian Johnson and Jeff Behrens, who are the two of the co-founders of Cul-de-sac, they have, Ryan in particular has a history with technology companies. He was one of the co-founders of Open Door, which most of you have probably heard about. And so he's tied into that technology, and in addition to exploring partnerships with some of these mobility companies, they have been, I know, exploring partnerships with even some companies like the delivery robot company that sort of would deliver your dinner or your groceries, from the curb to your unit. And so they're absolutely kind of wanting to be the beta test, or the place where new technologies are explored and integrated in a way that can make them successful.
On the chat, I guess just reiterating some facts. What is the mix of residential, non-residential, and open space? And then just reconfirming that the project's 100% rental and there's no for sale on units.
So the project is 100% rental. There are about approximately 640 units, approximately 30,000 square foot of non-residential square footage, and ground floor square footage in the center along the light rail, that village center, and about 60% of the project is public space, which is only possible because the cars were removed from the equation. And the other aspect that I didn't mention that I think is also really interesting is there's a series of spaces scattered throughout the project area called bookable spaces. And they range from anything, a small studio unit that you can go online and sign up for a guest to stay in, to small flex spaces that you could go online and sign up for a day, a week, or a month of the space to use as a social media hub, a workspace, artist studio, whatever you might want to do. So there's a lot of those spaces, small spaces programmed throughout the site, that are a really interesting way to make small living more comfortable, so you can kind of spill over into other spaces as needed.
Okay. I guess just a follow-up question. So just confirming that there's cul-de-sac is its own developer. There are no separate apartment developer, separate commercial developer. It's all under one roof.
So cul-de-sac partnered with Sunbelt, which is a Tempe-based, a Phoenix Metro-based, I think they're actually based in Scottsdale, developer, and they have a long history of broad range of development types, from residential to office and mixed use experience in that market. And so cul-de-sac partnered with them to help them execute the delivery of the project.
Then a series of questions about any pushback from either the surrounding community or the local jurisdiction or the local Department of Transportation, or anything that you had to accommodate as a result of input from those communities and agencies.
Well, I think that one of the really smart things that cul-de-sac did is they built the support of the decision makers in Tempe sort of very early on in the process, and got city manager, city council members really excited about the idea of being the first city with a cul-de-sac community. And it was not simple, just because the project is so different than anything else that's been done and that the planning staff has seen, but it was a really collaborative working relationship with the City of Tempe planning staff, to help define the correct path forward and provide them enough clarity where they can actually suggest the approval of the project, to make a recommendation to approve it. And, it took a lot of back and forth, for sure. Everything from just their comfort level with the amount of parking and how deliveries and other mobility choices are going to be integrated, to that interface with the Apache Boulevard, which is one of the primary east-west corridors in the city, and in addition to the light rail station, to how the bike lane that's along Apache gets integrated into the site, or sort of interfaces with the new development. We thought about possibly bringing the bike lane onto the sidewalk and making it more of a separated cycle track, but ultimately it just ended up being easier keeping it on, based on some preferences of local staff, to just leave it on the street and make sure it's just safer and still well executed as a project gets implemented.
Next general question is about large deliveries. I guess this in one way this gets rid of the humongous problem that vertical apartments have of package delivery rooms. But how is deliveries generally, e-commerce generally treated with this project?
Yeah, so they're the same larger network of paseos that have accommodate the fire and emergency access. On a handful of them, there are, 2 or 3 parking areas where either a car coming with an Amazon delivery or a move-in truck coming in for people to move their furniture in can, they can easily access their units. So it was definitely a part of the process of thinking about those deliveries. There is a clustered mail room as one example in one of the mixed use buildings. And that can also, it sort of went back and forth. There were multiple sort of delivery stations within buildings at some point, and we kept going back and forth between sort of having a couple different sort of shop front spaces where you could go pick up your packages or just let them be delivered. And I think that's still, that sort of detail is still being refined and will need to be refined as the project's getting occupied here in the next year.
And there's a question here about going back to the fascinating slide you had about what was initially planned for there versus the option that actually went forward. So I really understand the logic of saving the construction on the parking was the one that tipped the project into being feasible. The other thought I had is this is another strategy to actually increase the number of units because you don't have parking in a transportation node. Is that a more difficult case to make for both, the neighbors and the jurisdictions rather than the opposite case of scaling down something because you can't have parking? Or can you scale down something and still have more units than what originally could have been there with parking?
Yeah, that's a great question. I guess I don't want to. My message isn't that all 7-story buildings proposals should be replaced with 3 stories, because I think there's absolutely a role for 5 to 7-story buildings, especially in higher value markets near transit. I think because that project wasn't viable, I think this demonstrated how to get to viability in one way. And I think the only reason that it became this sort of 2 to 3 story missing middle scale is that was cul-de-sac's vision of having walk-up buildings, 100% walk-up buildings. And we tested a lot of variations early on that had, a series of a few 5 to 7 story buildings along that Apache corridor. And I think they may actually ultimately decide to put a few of them in as the project progresses and becomes successful. And I'm pretty sure there's flexibility in the entitlement to allow that. So it'll be interesting to see, because I think it would make sense, especially along Apache, to have 5-story buildings. But they wanted this particular, the first phases anyway, to really reinforce the vision they had of walk-up housing choices in a neighborhood scale community.
And there's a couple of questions here about the public transportation aspect. How critical is the presence of public transportation to the success of a project like this? Can other strategies compensate if you're at a greater distance from public transportation?
For cul-de-sac site selection, the public transportation and the network and the ability to go, 3 stops to Mesa, downtown Mesa in the eastern direction, and a couple stops to downtown Tempe, and even a few more stops to be at the airport. The Phoenix airport was really important to them. We haven't done it yet, but could this be viable without that major transit infrastructure? I actually feel it probably could be, if it's located in a community that has a very bikeable context, a strong bike network. But it is harder, especially for people that need to commute to jobs and major sort of job nodes. And so I think it's I'm glad cul-de-sac has it. I think it reinforces the need for cities to be thinking about these major transit investments. But I think especially at a smaller scale, we've done it, at least car light, without the major transit, but nobody's, I think it is ultimately viable. I think there's enough households out there that want to live at least car light, if not car free, and bike and walk and happy to take an Uber or Lyft to a lot of their locations. Yeah, I think it's viable for sure without the major transit.
Okay, and then question about the sustainability aspects. Can you speak about any sustainability details about the project? Anything with the construction or the design that speaks to the sustainability goal?
Yeah, I think as I mentioned earlier, the biggest aspect of sustainability for this project is just reducing the greenhouse gas emissions of residents, transportation being the biggest emitter. So that was the biggest goal. We talked a little bit about, can we start to integrate, green building systems into the buildings? But once again, the project was so innovative in so many other ways. A cul-de-sac was just, I think rightfully so, said, let's prove this model first. Then on the next project or the next phase, let's be thinking about, ratcheting up the sustainability, the green building aspect of the project. Now, that being said, is like, the simple elements that I talked about are just some of the, the shading elements, the passive cooling elements, absolutely just low-tech green approaches to the buildings. But otherwise, the construction technique is, it's just stick construction, conventional stick construction, and there's nothing specifically super green from a technology standpoint about it. But what we found, the missing middle neighborhood I showed you in Nebraska, our client was recently submitting for state tax credits for energy efficiency in buildings, and just totally accidentally those triplex and eightplexes and everything in between ended up being the most energy efficient buildings that submitted for that tax credit. So even just these, by stacking the units, you get to a lot of energy efficiencies of when your neighborhood has their air conditioner on, you're benefiting from that air conditioning indirectly in some ways. So yeah, we look forward to, I'm always a big fan of really pushing the green building as far as we can. In this particular project, it didn't make sense because there's so many other risks involved from our client's perspective.
There's a question here about how long did the entitlement process take for such an innovative project? How does that compare to a standard project?
It was fast. I may be incorrect by a couple of months, but I want to say it took about a year, just a little under a year, to get the project entitled, which by California standards is lightning's fast. It took 4 years for us to get an 8-unit cottage court approved in Northern California. So just to give you some example and a reason why we're several million units short on housing here in the Bay Area and most of the state. So the entitlement was pretty fast. The building permits then, which were the next phase, took about another year, a little over a year, just because of the complexity of the project and sort of getting all the infrastructure worked out and proper approvals for the building permits. And so by our experience, this was super fast, and it was only with the support of the city that the project was able to move through entitlements that quickly.
I have a question on the rental pricing and also the commercial rental pricing, I guess. How do they compare to new construction in the Tempe area? Is it a premium, or is it competitive, or what market type are they going after? Sort of a little bit of a premium market based on the huge amount of demand that you have on the waiting list. Can you speak a little bit about that?
Yeah, so cul-de-sac did the really smart thing of they ran their pro forma on just competing at the top end of the rents in the the Tempe sort of metro. And they just wanted to make sure they didn't assume, it was hard to assume like, well, what is the premium that we can gain? So they figured if the project could work at sort of competitive market rate rents, that the premium that they can get is just icing on the cake. And I can pretty much guarantee that they're going to get a premium, and they have. I wasn't able to get the information about rents yet. They're sort of rightfully so kind of holding that close to their chests right now until they get more units filled. But most projects where we've worked, even just being innovative in the missing middle and delivering living, whether it's for sale or rental, unlike anything else in the market, automatically gives you a competitive advantage and a premium, which is a good and a bad thing, right? Because all of a sudden it can push rents or sales prices outside of the attainable range that they were intended to deliver.
Now, you and I had a conversation before we went online that they're building the commercial first and then the residential later. And most developers build the residential first because they can sell it right away and then fill the commercial later. I was just thinking about it. Is that because you need to create the amenities first so that the people that are car free are more induced to live car free? And also, is car free, you mentioned that it's a choice. Is that a condition for living in cul-de-sac, or is it sort of some sort of honor system that it is car free? How does that work? Or can they use off-site parking, for example, instead of on-site parking?
Yeah, so first the commercial leasing and first commercial construction up front is highly unusual. They usually wait till they have a certain number of rooftops, but cul-de-sac's not bashful about trying to shake things up and try a different way. And I think they feel it's really important part of their brand and the identity of the community to have those amenities in place for even the first phase residents. And so getting a good coffee shop, getting a good restaurant, getting a good small urban market is, we knew from the very start that it'd be really challenging, in particular to get the market, even though we were designing space for it, but they just did a lot of heavy lifting early on to identify those tenants and make that happen. And they're also thinking, just in context of these pop-ups that they're doing, it's likely that they'll also have a fairly continuous run of food trucks in the main plaza space, sort of to activate it and to provide other food amenities and to provide create a destination as well. So yeah, it's super interesting. I'm glad they were successful. What was the second part of your question, Eric? Not remembering now.
To the food, yeah.
I don't remember.
Yeah, that was the first one. The other one.
Okay. Can I just mention that I saw a question.
Oh yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah, somebody just reminded me. You mentioned that the residents commit to living car free. Is that what kind of commitment is that? Is that like an honor system commitment? Can they use off-site parking, like a public garage? Or is that something that the developers really are committed to and work it into some of the, say, leases, that this is a car-free development?
I need to verify this, a little bit of a disclaimer. As I say this, I need to verify this with cul-de-sac in terms of where they ended up now that they have the first leases in place for the residents, that the intent was that if you choose to live here, you are committing to live without owning a car. So they don't want, 600 residents with cars that are parked in the adjacent neighborhoods. The point is to prove that people can live in this, without owning a car, with all these other mobility choices, that they want to prove the viability of it. And so the early discussions that there would be some sort of terms in the agreements of, just be an honor system of that you're not going to own a car if you choose to live in the community. Yeah, it's a lot of the first phase residents were like, I've been looking for car-free living. I don't want to have to move to New York City to get that. I noticed there was a comment, and I lived in New York. I lived in New York car-free for a number of years as well. But this is saying, hey, let's try this in a context that has historically been automobile dominated and culturally about owning a car, and do it at a neighborhood scale and prove that there is demand for this, so that they can ultimately think about taking it to scale and once they have that proof of concept. So it's super
There's
exciting.
another comment in the chat from Ryan Wozniak, and I guess we'll verify that, but he volunteers that the development agreement requires a lease of no parking anywhere near a fourth of a mile of the site as a condition of residency. So I guess that's something that we need to see, but it's kind of an
Ryan's from the
interesting.
Phoenix Metro. I know Ryan, so he probably knows better than me at this point. So.
Yeah, but that is an interesting part of the development.
Yeah,
and, definitely a crucial part of the experiment.
Yeah, and I noticed there was a question about construction, and so there's two different contractors. There's one that's delivering the mixed use buildings, and then there's one that's delivering the residential. But it's all being really managed by one entity, which is kind of cul-de-sac and Sunbelt, delivering it all. So it's an interesting method.
Well, I think we're out of time. We mentioned we were going to get you out of here at 6:15, so I wanted to take this opportunity to thank Dan for sharing his evening with us, telling us about this really fascinating project, which we hope to see more of, and maybe even the next phases of the project as it builds out, and maybe some versions of which may be applicable to other parts of the country, including in our part of the woods in the Mid-Atlantic and in the Northeast. So really fascinating. And so thank you, Dan, for sharing this evening.
Thanks for having me, Eric. It was a pleasure.
So as I mentioned, we're posting the recording. Just two announcements I'd like to share with the audience. We're still accepting applications for our Masters in Real Estate Development class for spring 2022. Classes start on January 24th. So if you're interested, or somebody who's interested, please link to the website on the screen. And I'd like to invite you to our next webinar for the new year on February 2nd, called Seeking Shelter, Changes in Housing Preferences. Our lecturer for that evening is Dr. Jessica Lautz, the Vice President of Demographics and Behavioral Insights for the National Association of Realtors. So please email me if you're interested. If not, you should receive an email from us inviting you to that event in February. So with that, I'd like to again thank Dan, thank everybody for their time tonight. Thank you for your interest in real estate education programming at George Mason University. And we hope to see you at our next events in the new year. Thanks very much.